Please feel, excuse me, please feel free to chime in or to type where you're tuning in from. And if you know, I would also invite you to type or to include the ancestral territorial land you're on as well. So naming the tribes. And if you don't know, here's a link for you. And I'll just read out some of the ones that are coming through because I really don't like silence, if you can't tell. So you have folks tuning in from Salt Lake City, the home of the Utes, the Shoots and the Paiutes, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. San Diego, Kumeyaay, Denver, the Ute and the Arapaho. That is also where I'm tuning in from. Goffstown, wow, this chat's going too fast. Glenwood Springs, Utes, Omaha, Washington, Seattle, the Duwamish Nation, Minneapolis, Dakota, and I'm not sure how to pronounce that, Ojibwe, Oakland, unceded Ohlone land.
Okay, so hello everyone. Welcome to the 2021 CALA President Program, Libraries as Catalyst for Serving Diverse Communities. As people coming in, I would like to say thank you for everyone to come in today. And for today, we will have 3 speakers to talk about building a pipeline of community connections, race, art, civil rights, and the socio-political forces that guided the hip-hop generation, and developing a diverse and inclusive environment through recruitment, HR practices, and professional development initiatives. I'm sure I will learn a lot from them today, and I hope you do too. So each speaker today will have about 15 minutes for their talk, and we will save all the questions and answers at the end. And during the presentation, we respectfully ask that you turn off your audio and save your question to the end. So now let's welcome our first speaker, Ozioma Aloziem. Ozi is the Denver Public Library's first Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Manager. She is also leading the Building a Pipeline of Community Connection and DPL's grant project examining equity in the library workforce, funded by the Institute for Museum and Library Services. In addition to her role at DPL, Ozi serves as a racial equity racial healing consultant for several organizations across the nation. She is also a proud member of the Palm Wine Collective, a Black female-led collaborative curating spaces, and Content for Black Collective Healing. Now let's welcome Ozi for her talk.
Good afternoon, or good morning, or maybe good evening. My name is Ozioma Aloziem. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I am a dark-skinned Black woman wearing pink, kind of clearish, wide circular lens glasses. I've got a Black septum ring and 2 gold hoops. I'm wearing a collared yellow shirt and a green head wrap, and I've got on green flower earrings. My background features some plants and a blank wall. And I start with a visual introduction because I don't want to assume how anyone is interacting or engaging in the space. And I'm trying to be more mindful about how I'm moving through the world and trying to do that from a praxis of accessibility. And so that is something that I have been trying to model in presentations in just new spaces where I'm meeting new people, and would invite you all to do the same as well. So without further ado, I will get into my 15 minutes, and I will try to be succinct because I do tend to ramble. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. And so some of you may have already seen the pre-recorded webinar I did, or where I spoke to, or may have watched or listened to the webinar that I recorded for ALA, going more in depth into this presentation. I'm going to try my best not to repeat a lot of what I shared there, and going to expand on some of what I talked about. So if you haven't, I would invite you to go ahead and check that out. But before I get into the meat of what I have to share, I do want to start with a land acknowledgement. So on the screen is a land acknowledgement that we use, I will speak for myself, when I'm doing talks for the library or on behalf of the library. And it comes from an adaptation of a resolution the City Council here passed in 2020. A land acknowledgement now precedes the Pledge of Allegiance at every City Council meeting. And I really appreciate that. On the screen is a condensed version, but I will read the entire thing because I think it's important to lift up all pieces of the land acknowledgement. And so it reads, Denver Public Library honors and acknowledges that the land on which we reside is the traditional territory of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples. We also recognize the 48 contemporary tribal nations that are historically tied to the lands that make up the state of Colorado. We honor elders past, present, and future, and those who have stewarded this land throughout generations. We also recognize that government, academic, and cultural institutions were founded upon and continue to enact exclusions and erasures of Indigenous peoples. May this acknowledgement demonstrate a commitment to working to dismantle ongoing legacies of oppression and inequities, and recognize the current and future contributions of Indigenous communities in Denver. And this land acknowledgement is important to read in its entirety because it's not only calling attention to the unjust and inhumane treatment that Indigenous people in this country experienced, right? But it's also lifting up the story of resilience, right? And their current contributions, because to act as though Indigenous people don't exist is current Indigenous erasure and genocide. And I'm sure many of you have seen land acknowledgements, but it's important to name why we do land acknowledgements. My full name is actually Ozioma Aloziem. Ozioma means good news, and Nkechi means God's gift, and Aloziem is my great-great-grandfather's first name. And that is to say that I am Igbo, and that is one of the oldest and largest Indigenous tribes of Africa. And it is located in Southeast Nigeria, which is where all of my family outside of my immediate family currently reside. And so for us as Indigenous people and for other Indigenous people in other parts of the world, it's important to name where we are both geographically and ancestrally, right? And so using land acknowledgements is a way to honor this important Indigenous tradition. And it's also a way to call attention to the ways in which we participate in current genocide and Indigenous erasure. Because to act as though we're not participating in that and to not challenge that disruption or to disrupt that is to be complicit to that. And so I invite you all to thoughtfully think about what it means to consider the land on which you come from, or the land on which you stand and the history behind that land. But then to also think about how you can commit to doing action, right? A land acknowledgement is just words. It doesn't mean anything unless you're pairing that with really intentional and meaningful action, whether that is uplifting the voices of Indigenous folks in your community, paying land taxes to local tribes, or donating to Indigenous groups that are advocating on behalf of and with other Indigenous folks across the country or across the world. So I invite you to do that, and I always start everything that I do with that because I think it's really important. Okay, so on the next slide are 5 bullet points that talk about the project activities of the grant that we received. So in 2019, we received a grant from the IMLS to basically look at how an organization could hypothetically recruit folks equitably into a work environment that is inclusive and has the space for career development and advancement, right? And so we did that in a couple of ways. We wanted to take a scan or a snapshot of what libraries across the nation were doing around EDI and workforce development. And we also wanted to look at what folks in our own organization had experienced. And so we worked with a research consultant, Dr. Namrita Singh, who interviewed folks from individuals from backgrounds underrepresented in our workforce, both current and former employees, and asked them about their experience and asked them what drew them to the library, right? What retained them, and also what an inclusive work environment looked like and felt like for them. And so she turned that into a really great report and made recommendations for our organization. The national scan, which I'll talk about in the next few slides, also provided really helpful information to see what other folks across the nation were doing, because I think oftentimes when it comes to this work, we're so busy doing it, we're not spending a lot of time writing it up or researching it or publishing it. And so this was a way to gather some of that data so that we could share it out to other folks across the nation, because that is a deliverable, that all of this data is going to be turned into a report and other learning opportunities so that folks can access what we learned. We also held a symposium and invited organizations, not only libraries from across the nation, to provide or to participate in a really intentional learning space, right? We wanted folks who had already indicated and were ready to start their EDI journey, or maybe had begun their EDI journey and wanted to be able to co-create with other individuals struggling through some of the pressing problems of our time. And so that was a 3-day symposium. That was also a really beautiful experience that was centered in an embodied approach to social justice, an embodied approach to this work. And a lot of really helpful information was gleaned from that engagement. And then one of the other pieces that I didn't talk about in the last presentation, or in the other presentation for ALA, is this culturally responsive wellness model. And that was sort of a natural evolution as we were diving through the work, and some of the themes that I was hearing, as well as my background as a social worker and understanding the ways in which racial battle fatigue and other fatigue that comes from being a marginalized person in a dominant space, what that can do to a person who is existing in this work environment, and how we can create solutions around that as an act of promoting an inclusive work environment. So I'll speak to that in a little bit. And so, like I said, we did a national environmental scan. And I won't go into the details of the survey. If there's time at the end, maybe I'll share. But it's basically based on a literature review that I conducted, looking at what current organizational assessments existed, embedding EDI through every facet of the organization. I did that through a review of the literature, but I also spoke with EDI practitioners across the country and locally to find out, how are you evaluating around this? What resources are you using, et cetera? And what are the promising or best practices as it relates to advancing EDI and workforce development? And so that turned into an 156 item survey or questionnaire that was sent out to libraries across the nation to invite folks to not only contribute this information for us, right, for our data collection, but to have their own baseline indicator of where are we and where should we maybe be focusing on, because I think when it comes to equity, so much can fall under that, and we want to do so much, but unless we know where we are and also where our opportunities are, we're not really set up for success. And so this was created as a tool to not only get that baseline, but also to be able to measure against your progress moving forward. Part of what this scan included was were qualitative interviews. So based on indication when the original survey was sent out, folks could indicate whether or not they wanted to participate in a follow-up interview. And so I conducted interviews, 15 to 20 interviews with library directors and EDI workers in libraries across the country to learn more about what came up in their assessment, to learn what strategies were working, what wasn't working, what were some of the barriers, how did they mitigate those barriers, and what advice would they give to libraries who were maybe a little bit behind them on their journey, right? Who were maybe one step previous, like what would you say to someone just starting this work based on your lessons learned? And so all of that is going to be turned into that report that I alluded to, but this is just some of the preliminary data that came up from that. And so for the assessment, 94 we had Ultimately, I collapsed the surveys because we got about 106 surveys turned in, but after aggregating scores for libraries who submitted multiple surveys per organization, our sample size wound up being 86. And so libraries ranged from 0 to 404. And so you can see that if you are like between 0 and 93, you're not yet started on your journey. And if you are all the way on the end side, you're leading the charge and you've been doing this work and you're making recommendations for other organizations. The mean was 134, so meaning the majority of libraries that completed the assessment indicated that they were ready to start their EDI journey. I won't go into the survey too much for the sake of time, but I will sort of go over just a brief overview of it. Again, it stemmed from a literature review that I conducted, as well as just conversations with EDI practitioners. And it was split into 19 domains that are geared around a particular organizational component. So examples of the organizational components on the screen are organizational values, internal culture, administrative systems and organizational policies, recruitment and hiring, organizational diversity. And I can make available the full print version of the assessment so you can see that more clearly. But each overarching domain then was split into 5 to 11 indicators per domain. I'm only going to be speaking to the overarching domains and not the indicators themselves for the sake of time, and because there's just a lot of data. But each organizational component itself was paired up with at least one domain, and those domains were the 19 overarching questions. And based on your answer to one of those 19 questions, you received some follow-up questions. And so those follow-up questions were really meant to operationalize what we meant by this broader question. So for example, if we're looking at internal culture, at our organization, have we transitioned to an inclusive culture and created systems and policies? If you say yes, you would receive about 5 to 11 follow-up questions asking you what we really meant by that, and for you to indicate whether or not you had done these things that are alluded or recommended as best practices or promising practices for this particular organizational component. Okay, I'm going to fast forward. And so on the screen now, I've displayed sort of aggregated summaries of the data. And so I'm going to explain how they were collapsed before I go into detail about what came up. And so the data was collapsed if an organization indicated that they were scoring well in general, meaning they had either selected moderate to a great extent for that particular domain or question. So for instance, if 55% of respondents selected moderate or to a great extent, that indicated to me that for this particular domain, organizations scored well. And if the majority of participants or respondents indicated that they had selected not at all or to a small extent for that particular domain, that indicated to me that across all organizations, that was an area that organizations were scoring low. So that's how I wanted to sort of separate the data out. But across all organizations, no areas scored well in general, meaning in general, more than 55% of all participants indicated that they were scoring rather low on these domains. And so I'm going to be focusing on the 10 lowest scoring domains for the sake of time. By and large, libraries who participated in this assessment scored the lowest in performance management. And so on the screen, it shows, let me move this for a second. 91% of organizations or libraries who completed this assessment indicated that at our organization, we do not include EDI related metrics in all evaluation and accountability mechanisms for management and staff. 90% indicated that they do not include EDI related metrics in all evaluations in the organizations for its projects and programs. 87% indicated that they don't routinely collect, disaggregate, and analyze EDI data for programmatic and operational work and use this information in decision-making and planning. 85% indicated that they don't have effective policies for retaining and promoting the advancement of historically underrepresented individuals. So that relates to organizational diversity, whereas the first two were related to performance management, and then the third around EDI research and data. And then the last one on the slide, 81% of organizations indicated that they have not embedded EDI values in all marketing and communication policies and practices. So pairing that with the conversations that I had with folks, what does that mean? This says to me that there is there's a lack of internal focus, meaning a lot of the EDI SJ work that has happened in the library world has been really external facing and has been directed at customer experience. And so it's time to really think about how are we performing? How are we holding ourselves accountable to those performance goals? And how are we doing that based on the best available data and research around EDI promising practices? How are we engaging in meaningful assessment, right? That's one of the things that kept coming up. Is your organization routinely collecting information about workforce diversity? Is it looking at retention? Is it asking questions about barriers to recruitment and advancement and retainment? Are you regularly assessing folks' EDI competencies? Those are the things that are important to demonstrate not only how you're progressing on your EDI journey, but also where you are. And then organizational diversity, that again is like thinking about what are our recruitment practices? Where are we posting our job? What barriers are there to the positions that we have? And are we creating incentives and professional development opportunities for folks who are trying to advance? Are we creating space for continuing education? Are there mentorship and leadership development programs, et cetera? Organizational, so now again, there's more scores here. So on the screen it reads, or what the first column is around, again, organizational diversity. So 80% of organizations indicated that they don't have policies and strategies for maintaining and protecting organizational diversity, right? That's looking at both recruitment and retention. 80% of organizations indicated that they don't have policies and an organizational EDI plan with clear goals, strategies, and indicators of progress. So that is pointing to strategy. 80% of organizations indicated that they are not an EDI leader and are not helping to build the field and best practices. This is relating to organizational commitment and advocacy, right? Because part of the work is sharing what you've learned so other people can meet you on your journey, so that you're pulling other people along and that we're all journeying together in the direction of equity and not doing that in silos or doing that in isolation. 79% indicated that they don't ensure that EDI issues are integrated into fundraising and budgeting decisions, so pointing to budgeting and fundraising. And then 78% indicated that at our organization, we have not transitioned into an inclusive culture and created systems and policy. So that's pointing to internal culture. What came up in the interviews? More planning and focus is needed, right? One of the things that I kept hearing from folks when I asked the question of what would you do differently, it was really around we need to start incrementally. We need to pick one issue area and strategically work around it, right? It's creating this broader strategy based on where you know your organization to be, but then starting with small bite-sized chunks that are measurable, that are contributing to this bigger strategy. And it's knowing exactly what you're fighting for, or what exactly direction you're going in, and not just sort of being reactive, right? Because the moment is called upon, or because you know that there's a need, but thinking about what is this sustainable plan for this? How does it align? And what is this plan or this decision based on? What also came up was that there needs to be designated staff, coordinators, stakeholders, resources, right, that are shaping EDI initiatives. That means creating space for folks to have time to do it, creating positions for folks to lead this work, really institutionalizing your commitment so that it isn't just happening in silos or as grassroots efforts, but it's really part of what your organization is hoping to do. Prioritizing EDI and budgeting, and not only like creating an equity budget, but making sure that as you're thinking about how you're spending your dollars, how how are we doing this in a way that is disrupting the inequities that historically disadvantaged, historically excluded communities have faced? How are we doing that in all aspects of our budgeting and not just making sure that we have a department over here that has money that gets it? And then internal culture, that really means intentionally creating inclusive policies and practices, increasing representation in leadership. That's either new spots on leadership teams or people who are in positions of power stepping aside or stepping down, right? That's looking like prioritizing, specifically when we're talking about racial equity, prioritizing Black, Indigenous, Asian American, other groups of color, right? Valuing the wellness of those groups of people, providing safe spaces for those folks, and developing those practices and procedures to address harmful environments, and communicating and holding yourself accountable to those policies when they're created, as well as paying for labor. And that includes not only for the work experience itself, but for the unique cultural experiences that different groups bring. I'll skip over these two. And if we have time at the end, I'll come back. But the last two slides I'll share are just some of the things to consider. And again, this is based on what came up in the assessments as well as what came up in the interviews and the conversations that I've had. And also just what comes up in the research, because like I said, I did a pretty extensive literature review, and I work as a racial equity consultant for other organizations. And so sort of combining my lived experience with what is written in the academic space with what I'm hearing experientially from other folks. So recruitment and hiring, some questions, because I'm not gonna answer answer the questions for you or solve for you, right? I'm gonna give you some things to think about so that you can answer and solve for those things for yourself, right? Because that's what it really means to do equity work. It's not taking a really prescriptive approach and saying, okay, these are the 10 things that I can do, I'm gonna go and do this. But like, if this is what I'm supposed to consider, what is that gonna mean for my own organization? And how can I be really thoughtful about that based on the experiences of other people? And so recruitment and hiring. Has every stage of the hiring and recruitment process been evaluated to identify bias and barriers and ensure fairness and equity in hiring policies, practices, processes, and behaviors? Again, this could look like an audit, looking at your current data, making sure you're actually keeping collection or of demographic changes in your workforce, right? Having that baseline understanding, and then setting those goals around that. Retention. How do we ensure that the diverse people, right, those historically excluded, those historically underrepresented, however we're going to say that, how do we ensure that those people that we're recruiting stay? And are we tracking that data? Are we asking staff what retains them, why they stay, and making sure that we're doing more of that? Have we done a retention study? Because recruitment is really important, right? But it needs to be talked about hand in hand with retention. Because if you recruit folks into a space and you're only setting them up to be harmed, we have a certain ethical responsibility to not do that, right? Because not only does that hurt that person and create harm that person is going to carry throughout their career, but it hurts the organization because the ROI on that isn't really justified, because then you're going to continue having to hire and fill these positions. You're going to, that's a knowledge gap that's going to exist. That's resources gaps, right? That's work we don't want to have to do if we're not thinking about recruitment when we're thinking about retention. And so some of the ways to support retention are around employee relations and internal equity. How are employee concerns being handled? What feedback processes are in place? How are we ensuring internal equitable practices, including around pay, right? Is there a grievance process? And how often are you conducting audits, not just the one-time thing, but routinely? What is your schedule to make sure that we are continuously maintaining internal equity? And are there policies around harassment and microaggressions and what it actually means to have an inclusive work environment? Training and professional development is the next bullet. So are we providing staff with the resources they need to grow, thinking about the different ways in which people might want to grow? Like sometimes growth looks like going deeper into whatever it is you're passionate about. Sometimes growing means going up and going wider or going out, right? And so thinking about making sure we're not sort of putting a learning plan or a perception or an understanding of growth that isn't really in line with how a person is wanting to grow within your organization. And what pipelines have been established for career advancement, whether that is leadership training, mentorship opportunities, what specific pipelines, and have you articulated that with the onboarding processes to make sure that that's well understood and communicated so that folks even know what opportunities are available once those pipelines have been established. And staff inclusion. How are we fostering a culture of inclusion and belonging? What supports are available to staff from underrepresented groups? And so making sure, right, if we are recruiting folks into this environment, what supports are going to be available to them? And how are we making sure that we're holding other folks accountable to maintaining that inclusion and belonging so that they're not having to brace themselves when they're coming into the work environment? And I'm not going to say, and I'm not going to sit here and act like DPL is doing all of this all at once really, really well. Again, these are the things that were coming up based on the research for all of us to consider, right? And so part of how we've been considering, this will be the last slide, sort of really around internal equity is this culturally responsive wellness model that we've been piloting. So as part of our commitment to promoting racial equity, we're continuing to look at inclusion and how we actually operationalize that commitment to better align not only our practices, but our policies and the work environment that we're existing and working in. And so we've been working on creating strategic supports that really help foster and maintain an inclusive environment where all members can thrive, but making sure we're being particularly aware of staff who might be more vulnerable in our work environments because of the dominant nature of our library spaces. And so over the last year, and really over the last few months, more intentionally, I've been working on creating this culturally responsive wellness model that DPL has been piloting to promote wellness and well-being as an integral part of an inclusive work environment. And so I will just very quickly go over some of the different components of what we've been doing. And so we've been really normalizing wellness conversations. We've been talking about that at all levels of the organization, really demonstrating that in our staff meetings, what it means to normalize that. Yes, we have to talk about how we're doing and how that's interacting with how we're showing up in the world. So that isn't something that people are hiding or feel ashamed about, because that is what creates the space, right, where folks feel that they can come to one another for support. We've been holding racial healing circles once a month since last year. Last year, they were only for folks of color, so Black, Indigenous, Asian American, Asian Pacific Islander, Latina, all of the different ways in which we say non-white, right? It was really for BIPOC folks to find space to talk about the different things that were going on last year. A lot of that did really focus around the racial uprisings that we saw. And so this year we really wanted to be more intentional about how do we expand this to be more reflective of the other concerns that are happening. And so really thinking about BIPOC solidarity as a theme of this year, as well as creating an additional circle for all staff, knowing that racial healing and is something that our whole organization should be participating in together. We conducted some wellness assessments to get an understanding of how are our staff doing, how are they accessing our wellness resources, what are barriers to some of the wellness resources that we have, so that we can strategize around those barriers, knowing that we do have a lot of really robust options and opportunities, but if folks can access them, that doesn't really help. So how can we make sure that we are cognizant of the things that are getting in the way of that? We brought on a mental health consultant, and so she is a bilingual consultant that's available for 10 to 15 minutes, not 10 to 15 minutes, 10 to 15 hours each week, and she provides support to staff who just need someone to hold space, or who might be a little bit hesitant to seek therapy on their own or other mental health resources. And so she connects with folks and then is able to connect them with other resources that we have, as well as just serve as a point of contact when things happen. We have a Shine app. So this is a really inclusive wellness app that we're inviting all staff to subscribe to. And it's created by 2 women of color. It's a really inclusive wellness app and does a really great job of providing not only mindfulness meditations, but also articles and resources for our staff. We've been doing trauma-informed leadership training, and we'll be continuing that. We're rolling out affinity groups or employee resource groups, and then we've been in conversation about wellness hours, so providing a set amount of hours that our staff could have access to prioritize their wellness needs. Okay, I am over time, so I will stop now. That was a very abrupt end, but if there's time at the end, I'll answer questions.
Hey, thank you, Ozzy, for your wonderful talk. And I believe there are a lot of things we need to do to build a staffing model that fosters DEI. Now, let's welcome Christina Goeller. Christina is the Director of Human Resources and Organizational Development at the University of Houston Libraries, where she focuses on organizational effectiveness, human resources, employee development, recruitment, and onboarding. She works closely with members across the organization to ensure equity and inclusion practices are incorporated into these areas. Christina's professional interests include serving as a leader and mentor within state and national associations to advance EDI and advocate for policies and practices that advance the work of all types of libraries. She served as the president of the Texas Library Association in 2020 to 2021 and was a fellow in the 2018 to 2019 Association of Research Libraries Leadership Fellows Program. Now let's welcome Christina.
Thank you, Winley. Let me just share my screen here. Okay. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Ozzy, for letting me share this space with you on this panel, and thank you to the leaders of CALA for inviting me to be a part of this important talk. I want to take a moment and share the same practice that Ozzy has taught me today and share my visual appearance. I am a white-skinned female. I have long brown straight hair, and today I am wearing a green silk top. I also want to share a lot of the same ideas that Ozzy presented. It will be talking about equity and inclusion from an organizational development lens. Many of the ideas and components of the organization that Ozzy talked about, particularly what she found in her research, is relevant to what I'm going to share. And I think it'll dive a little bit into some of the ways that you might see this in practice. Okay, so a quick bit of background. What do we mean by organizational development? Organizational development is a study and implementation of practices, systems, and techniques that affect organizational change. It encompasses a system-wide umbrella of thoughts, as illustrated by this diagram on the screen. So it begins with leadership. And when we talk about leadership, it's leadership at the top, but also across the organization, positional leadership, as well as those who are influencers in your organization. People, the workers in your organization, but also in the case of libraries, the people we serve. We need to be thinking about them as a part of our organization as well. And then our structures, the hierarchies of the entire organization, and hierarchies as the whole organization, but also hierarchies within particular units if you're in a large, complex library. The purpose, your organization's why, your mission and vision, and then the mechanics. This is one where I spend a lot of my time. How do you get it all done? Your services, your policies, and your practices. And finally, the reward structures. So what I'll encourage you to do is start thinking about reward structures, not of how we recognize people for their successes in terms of traditional awards, but think about it in terms of pay and promotions and retention. All of those things are how we reward people from the umbrella of organizational development. This model tells us that organizations are complex systems, and we need to understand how these different complexities affect equity and inclusion. So one of the things that Ozzy said is, this is not a one-all-fits-all approach, and it's not a one and done or a checkbox. It's when you're dealing with a complex system, there's a lot of different components and things that affect one another that we have to look at. So one thing that I want to mention before I go further is to, as you think about your own organization, recognize that you might think about a different place to begin as somebody else in another organization. Maybe you have an organization where their leadership at the top is already very diverse. So maybe that's not the place where you have to begin, but maybe you have a lot of existing policies and practices that are not inclusive or equitable, and maybe that's the place to begin. So it's going to be very dependent on your organization. And that is because of culture. So let me quickly define culture and talk about what I mean by the stasis of culture. Culture is the shared beliefs, assumptions, norms, and values of the people in the organization. It can be very hard to change culture. If the leadership and the majority of the people who hold power, any kind of power, don't see a need to question or change beliefs or assumptions, then there aren't going to see a need to examine the mechanisms or the structures or the rewards, which is needed to truly move forward ED&I work. In that sense, the culture is maintained by people, and that is going to seek a lot of stasis. One of the things that we know is that projects, research like what Ozi has done, help give us opportunity to see little places where we can begin that change. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a full-fledged, I'm going to do a whole bunch of culture change, because that's not going to happen when culture seeks stasis, but little incremental changes and project-based work can go a long way. So with this shared understanding, I also want to mention that I've already mentioned in one size fits all, it's not a one size fits all, but also that this is a long game. If culture seeks stasis and it's very hard to change, this is something that will take us a long time to be working on. And even when we do achieve progress, we have to work hard to maintain it. So let's dive into some of these components of organizational development, beginning with leadership and structures. My first recommendation is to examine the hierarchies that exist in your organization. The horizontal structure, so the top down, is an easy way to begin. And start looking at it with a very critical, equity-based eye. Are these flat, or are they rigid or siloed? Do men or white folks dominate at the top? Do men or white folks dominate at the supervisory level? And then thinking about those structures, who's in them and who's in those positions, how does that impact the norms and the assumptions of that culture? And how does that impact how it's shared across the organization? And then also thinking about laterally across units. Does one department seem more homogeneous than another? And how does that affect continuity of services, particularly when we're talking about those front-facing services and working with diverse patrons? Also, and I can't emphasize this enough, but when you have homogeny in one unit and more diversity in another, that can impact the way people work together within your organization across those units. When taking a critical look at the makeup of your hierarchies, you can begin to recognize where power dynamics and privilege may be impacting how you're working towards equity and inclusion. And that brings me to my next point, and that's to recognize power dynamics and privilege. In our society, we know, or hopefully y'all know, that men hold more privilege than women, whites more than BIPOCs, gender conforming versus gender non-conforming, and I could go on, related to sexual orientation or religion and age. These privileges are brought into the workplace, but we don't talk about them in the workplace. And when you think about these privileges and then put them on top of some of the structural dynamics that exist, power dynamics, supervisors hold more power than subordinate, salaried employees more than hourly, and in the library world, what we considered MLS professionals versus paraprofessionals, or however you refer to them, all of those are power dynamics within the structure. When you put those two on top of one another, you have a lot of barriers to lack of voices being heard, lack of psychological safety, lack of diverse services for patrons. So one of the things that we have to do is really bring transparency to these dynamics and actually start talking about them and recognize them. When we recognize these power dynamics, we tend to begin to move toward thinking about how we can break down or create other opportunities for voices to be heard, or safer avenues for voices to be heard. And that's one of the critical things to do, is to create other structures to do that. When we talk about how complex some of our structures are, or if we cannot diversify our leadership quickly, but even if we're trying to get there, one of the ways that we can help is to create these other structures for voices to be heard. One of the ideas that is common across certain organizations is creating affinity groups or ED&I teams. These types of groups, particularly affinity groups, allow people to connect with people that they share the same lived experiences with, talk about the experiences, and hopefully there's an opportunity for those voices to be raised directly up to administration or the people who hold the structural power. ED&I teams can help reduce power dynamics as well by bringing more people across the organization into the conversation. So I mentioned that leadership is not just about the positional leadership, but also the influencers, and making sure that the leadership is listening to some of those influencer voices who are a part of these teams. One thing that I've seen that's very successful is organizations inviting ED&I team members or affinity group leads to be a part of the leadership team structure, so that every topic, when it's being discussed, has that ED&I lens or that ED&I voice associated with it. These kinds of groups can also create opportunities for learning and dialogue outside of the hierarchies and power dynamics that exist. One of the things that you'll hear me talk about, and Ozi talked a little bit about too, was this idea of ED&I related to performance management and goals. Well, sometimes that power dynamic with a supervisor is not conducive to creating really strong goals for people around ED&I. So having structures in place where people can engage in dialogue and learning because of an ED&I goal that's outside of that power dynamic will bring more fruitful conversations. And last, related to leadership and structure, is to hire leaders with ED&I capacity. I believe that we have to have leaders at the top who are willing to engage in this type of examination and recognition. Like I said, all of these things are intertwined. And one thing that a study I want to bring up from a few months ago is an Ithaca study titled National Movements for Racial Justice and Academic Library Leadership. They found that library leaders highly value leadership capacity for fostering ED&I, but in that same study, they looked at job postings for directors, and those postings are not reflecting the need to bring that value or to have it as a skill set or capacity. I really want to push us to, next time that your organization is posting any kind of position that has a leadership role, is to make a qualification in that job description that is related to ED&I capacity. We need to hire leaders with that capacity to make this work impactful and ongoing. So talking about people and purpose next. One of the things that I think that we talk a lot about is why we value ED&I, but do we really know why we value ED&I? Is it rooted in our mission and vision? I think there's a lot of talk about performative allyship or doing this work through statements or a bottom line gain, and it's not truly an anti-racist approach. So I would ask you to really examine how your organization is looking at ED&I work. Is it just a few action steps? Is it a one-off thing? And is it handled by just a few people? If so, you need to move ED&I work to be a core part of the purpose for being, for your services, for your patrons, and for your workers. And that is connected to thinking about this from a systems approach. Integrated into everything we do, from where you hire, from how you promote, how you pay, how you create policies. One of the ways to also do this is to hire for that ED&I commitment. While I believe ED&I starts with leaders, it's also everybody's job to move forward. And to truly change culture, a big piece of that is the people in the culture. Start by hiring for the ED&I commitment, and I mean truly doing this. Expectations and job descriptions that people will come in with the potential to make an impact. Don't just aim for hiring diverse applicants, which is really important, but also us white folks coming in with a commitment and evidence to show that we have done the work or that we're willing to learn and get on that journey. Some organizations require a diversity statement. Others put it in their job requirements. At the University of Houston, we have intentionally added questions at certain points of the interview day that relate to ED&I and ask for evidence of how people have engaged in this work, either personally or within the profession. And then we have a feedback survey that goes off across the library, and everybody in the organization can provide feedback directly about how this person would impact ED&I in our organization. And we've had instances where we chose not to hire a relatively strong candidate because they weren't going to come in and be willing to move forward this work. Along with that, of course, is examining those hiring practices. And I won't spend too much time on this because I know that Ozi also discussed it. I think there's a lot of presentations that already exist out there about examining hiring practices. But one of the things that I encourage people to do is, before you even choose to move forward with hiring, is to start with ED&I. In that position description, does it invite you into a culture of inclusion? What does it say about ED&I when you write it? And who are you already excluding in your mind before you've even written that position to announcement? Your use of jargon, pronouns, required years of service, or an overuse of preferred qualifications, which I would say is very common in libraries, to put so many preferred qualifications in that we have a number of applicants who won't even begin to think about applying. And research shows us that women and BIPOCs tend to not apply if there's too many preferred qualifications. Also, when thinking about all of this, and we talk a lot about bias and recognizing bias, is your hiring manager and your search committee trained to do that? And are they also trained to review resumes and root out ageism and consider alternative experiences? If not, you have to build that into the system. And inclusive interview practices. One of the things that we're doing here, and I know that it's happening in a couple other organizations as well, is examining your hiring practices from a white normative experience. What are you expecting to happen that's been put into practice based on a white only lens? Dress codes, hair and makeup, or dialect. And talk about those things and talk about where they show up and why it creates barriers. When I talked about culture earlier, culture being the norms, the beliefs, and the assumptions, those exist within the culture of your organization. And so somebody from the outside is not going to necessarily know what those norms and assumptions are. So one of the biggest failure points for interviews and what makes them not inclusive is we expect somebody to come in and perform within our norms and assumptions, but they don't know those norms and assumptions. So one of the things we can do from the get-go to create an inclusive interview process is to start everybody at the same page. Have pre-interview mentor sessions where you share what are the expectations of the interview, what kinds of questions are going to be asked, what some of the norms or assumptions that are going to show up in that interview. So you actually end up assessing better the skills and the knowledge rather than somebody's ability to perform and recognize what those norms and assumptions are, which really, in many ways, the norms and assumptions tend to benefit the white folks rather than our people of color. Ozi also mentioned the onboarding program, and this is one that's near and dear to my heart. You have to start everybody off at the same point of success. And a lot of it goes back into understanding culture and how we share components of our culture, whether that's negative or positive. Onboarding has to be very intentional, and it has to be a year long at the least. It has to be something that focuses not just on the job duties, but also those social and cultural aspects. So many times, people are not successful in organizations because they're not understanding some of those social and cultural norms from the get-go. This is also something that shifts based on the experiences, the lived experiences that somebody's going to bring, and making it work based on what they're bringing to the table. So an inclusive onboarding program tries to examine all aspects of the culture and systematically introduce and discuss them with the new employee and give them avenues and new perspectives to offer opportunities for change. So it's a two-way street. It's not just us teaching them about what this organization is going to be like, but asking them for feedback about what they're experiencing so that we can change the practices that are not so great and improve on the practices where we're doing well in the area of inclusion and equity. Again, the power dynamics come into play here because you can't just be learning parts of the culture and the job from your supervisor. You have to have other people that are there that somebody can connect with. So going back to those affinity groups, or also offering a mentor around some of the job duties or a buddy around some of those social aspects. And thinking about it, for those of you who might be instruction librarians or teachers in the room, it's the same thing about having a learner-centered approach, figuring out what their lived experiences are and what background and experiences they're going to bring and match your approach to them. I'm behind on my slides. The last component here is regularly assessing the climate. We talk a lot about assessing our services all the time. And I believe that we need to be assessing our internal climate on a regular basis as well. Again, we bring in new people. We need to make sure that we're hearing voices as we're making progress towards equity and inclusion. We need to know where we're doing well and where we're not, and make changes based on that. The next is the mechanics and the rewards. Building ED&I into accountability systems. When we talk about doing harm in the workplace, particularly around microaggressions and white supremacy culture, when people do harmful things to others, we have to have systems of accountability to encourage dialogue and really see change. And I'm not necessarily just talking about this from a punitive perspective, but rather thinking about it from the position of a learning organization. We're going to make mistakes in this work, and we have to be willing to accept that we're going to make mistakes, apologize, and learn from it. Accountability structures have to allow us to do that, to move us away from the white fragility and the defensiveness that show up when the accountability structures aren't there from a perspective of a learning organization. I think it's interesting, Ozi, you're finding about, I think it was 91% do not include ED&I metrics at all in performance management. And that's something that I want to emphasize today, particularly to root out some of the systemic problems related to microaggressions or white supremacy culture. Performance management is not just about giving feedback on the technical components of the job, but also how you work well as colleagues and how you contribute to an equity and inclusion environment. If you aren't including equity and inclusion as a performance expectation, then you're not really fully valuing it. You're not getting that feedback loop that's going to allow for change. And then outside of performance management, people need to have the channels in place, and they need to know the channels that are in place to report harm safely, whether it be an HR professional, an ombuds person, or an equal opportunity services office. Who is it in the organization? Is it easy to access? And do people know about it? I also believe this is a really critical place where leaders at the top have to be willing to set these expectations. And if you don't have an HR professional who is a leader in the organization, who's also willing to make those expectations and work with leadership to do so, then that's probably a first step. Human resources has to be at the table around a lot of these changes. Reducing barriers through documentation and transparency. One of the things that we don't always think about is making sure that policies are consistent and that they're documented. And I'm just realizing I'm getting close to out of time. So I'm going to move on to thinking about avoiding action bias when making decisions, particularly when it comes to policies that affect people. Giving time to make sure that all the perspectives and voices are heard and not acting too soon. I like to quote Brene Brown's work in this area where she talks about you have to really rumble with things for a while before jumping into decisions to make sure that all the perspectives are included. And my favorite part of this work is interrogating our HR systems for root causes of disparities, giving a really critical eye to existing policy structures and programs and services to figure out who is inadvertently harmed, what voices have been left out. Most, if not all, of our HR systems were designed by and for the benefit of white males. And if you have not gone back in your organization and really interrogated those, then you probably haven't done some of the deep dive work. And I'll wrap up because I know we're at the end of time, but I just want to say that this work, particularly around thinking about policies and mechanics and structures, is iterative. It has to be intentional. Don't assume somebody else is going to come in with that organizational development, equity, inclusion lens. It has to be something that everybody's thinking about, and it has to be ongoing because, again, it's a long game and it takes a lot of work to change culture. Thank you so much for your time and attention. And Winley, I will pass it over to you.
Thank you everyone for attending today's session, and thank you for our speakers. It looks like we are running out of time for questions, and I've posted our speakers' emails, and I'm sure that you will all handle questions later if you, so people feel free to send your questions to our speakers. Thank you everyone.
Okay, thank you all very much. I'm going to end the recording and close the